One of the key elements in our upbringing was a real reliance on God's providence, that God will provide for you, and also that miracles were real and they really did happen. I'll give you one example. My parents ran a youth group, which they called Teenage Club. This was probably the late 1950s, early 1960s. They were driving home one night in the station wagon, and for those of you who don't know what station wagon is, it's a big American car with 3 seats and plenty of room for a family. And the seats were folded down in the back, and me and my older brother and sister were asleep in the car as they were driving home, and they were going down a little country lane in Pennsylvania with steep banks on either side. And they went over the brow of the hill. They saw another car coming in the opposite direction at full speed. And this is a narrow country lane with no place to turn. And the way they described it was, we braced ourselves for head-on collision. And my mom said, we actually went down into the next gully and up the other side, and sure enough, there was the other car coming straight at us. She said it was so close that we could see the other driver's terrified face as he realized what was going to happen. And then my dad said, suddenly, I looked in the rearview mirror, and his taillights were receding in the opposite direction, and they said, the Lord preserved us. The 2 cars went through each other without a collision happening. And my dad testified, said there was no way that other car could have gone around us, or we could have gone around him. He says it was a real miracle. But my parents told that story like, yeah, miracles happen. We believe it. Yeah. So there was that element of God's provision and the reality of the faith there in our lives. And we found that almost all of our friends and family had a similar kind of story. In one way or another, they witnessed that God had provided in their life, that God was real, that prayer was real, and answers to prayer were real, and that this was a foundational element of our lives, that it was not a fairy tale.
I grew up in a similar context to Father Longenecker. As a family, we never had any doubt that the supernatural realm existed and that God would intervene in various ways in our day-to-day lives to show us His power and His character. And these experiences were foundational to our faith, as I know they are for many. Which is interesting and something of a paradox. Because on one hand, most of the people I know who have a very strong faith seem to base that trust largely on what they consider to be divine intervention in their lives and direct personal encounters with God. They point to answered prayer, miraculous healing, mystical experiences, and providential guidance as the key events in their lives, moments that play a major role in convincing them that God is real and ensuring them that He is good. Now, of course, I should clarify that these are not standalone stories, and they involve more than an interior feeling. Although there's nothing wrong with interior feeling, if you saw Jeremy Christensen's conversion story, you know the problems with relying only on that. No, I'm referring to an experience that has some element of intersubjectivity. You can check the x-rays, talk to witnesses, see the donation letter that came in at just the right time, etc. Even mystical experiences, while not the same type of event as, say, a healing, are more than just a feeling. Now, what is interesting, and where the paradox comes in, is that along with how common these stories are, is just how seldom they are shared. People have miraculous experiences, but they don't tell anybody about them. For example, Professor J.P. Moreland tells the story of how he was speaking at a large church about how to nurture God confidence in people when a young man on the church staff approached him rather sheepishly and began to share something from his own journey. About 4 years earlier, the young man was in a machine shop when heavy machinery fell on him and fractured his chest and hands. He was rushed to the doctor, x-rayed, and sent home that evening with pain medication. He was then scheduled to come back the next morning for further examination and treatment. That evening, some Christian friends came to his house and prayed for his healing. Even though he was on pain medication, he could still feel pain. However, as the people prayed, the pain vanished, and the swelling in his hands left. He was startled. The next morning, the surgeons took new x-rays, which indicated that the fractures were completely healed. The doctors also noted that the swelling was gone, something that just does not happen so quickly on its own. When the doctors compared the 2 sheets of x-rays, it was clear that he had been miraculously healed. The fractures were gone. Now, the reason I bring that up is that the young man had never shared that story before, and when asked why, he responded that he had kept the story to himself because he didn't want to talk about himself or appear weird to people. Well, this is consistent with my findings as well. A lot of us have very strong personal testimonies of God's intervention in our lives, but we very rarely share them with others. There are a few reasons for this. We'll start with the two mentioned in the story. The first is supposed humility. The young church staff member didn't want to gloat over his miraculous healing, and of course that's the right attitude. We're not to glory in ourselves as if our own righteousness or skill was responsible for a supernatural occurrence. However, that does not mean that we shouldn't celebrate what God has done and share it with others. Indeed, remembering and celebrating God's action is an important spiritual discipline for fostering greater trust in Him. God filled the Israelite calendar with festivals and feasts for this very reason. Proclaiming these acts is also an important part of reaching others. For example, in the first evangelistic sermon Peter ever preached, in the midst of an outpouring of supernatural signs and wonders at Pentecost, he emphasized the evidence of the miraculous. Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. That's Acts 2:22. Also, Paul consistently shared the story of his vision on the road to Damascus, Acts 22 and 26, for example. Spiritual experiences can theoretically cause a person to be conceited, admittedly. See 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7, for example. But guarding against pride does not necessitate that we keep silent about what God has done. Then there is the weirdness factor. I don't know exactly what the young man was thinking in not wanting to be considered weird, but I suspect he didn't want to be associated with charlatans. Again, this is understandable. Nobody wants to be lumped in with crooked faith healers and televangelists who make all sorts of fraudulent claims. However, the fact that counterfeits exist does not mean that the real thing does not. We can't stop telling true stories just because other people tell false ones. A third reason is that we are playing by the skeptic's rules. The desire to not appear weird may also be a sign of something more problematic, an implicit acceptance of many of our society's secularist and naturalistic assumptions about life. It seems that many Western Christians have adopted elements of an anti-supernatural bias, perhaps even unwittingly, through the influence of our prevailing culture. One of the places this bias shows up is in our belief regarding what may reasonably be discussed in the public square. For generations, we have been told that religious experiences are private matters that should be kept private. If you want to talk about them in your prayer meetings and church services, that's fine, but don't bring them outside those walls. The underlying idea here is that religious experiences don't offer us any objective information about reality anyway. Well, this is false, and we need to be very careful about implicitly accepting that lie by refusing to offer spiritual experiences as evidence in, for example, a worldview discussion. We also see this attitude in the reluctance of Christians to speak about apparent encounters with supernatural beings, a hesitancy to which I plead guilty as well. In the 90s, I spent several years working at a camp for inner-city youth. One night, I got a call to come down to help with a rowdy boy who was causing trouble. When I arrived at the dining hall, I could see that this was no ordinary case. The boy was screaming, attacking people, and tearing the place up with a strength and zeal that just didn't seem to match his body. I finally got my arms around him in a bear hug, but it was all I could do to keep him from injuring me and the others around him. As he continued to flail and yell, the camp director and I were at a loss as to what to do. The boy didn't seem to be tiring out, but I certainly was. So the director decided to pray. I don't remember what words she used exactly, but I vividly remember what happened the millisecond she said amen. The boy fell asleep. I mean, instantly. He was completely out, with his head resting on my shoulder. He went from cussing and punching to unconscious in the blink of an eye. Well, we were shocked. I carried the boy down to the nurse's station and put him to bed. Several hours later, he awoke with a smile, laughing and joking. He seemed to be a brand new person. Now, none of us on staff had a particularly charismatic background. We were not ones to see angels and demons under every stone. However, we all came to the same conclusion about our experience that night. Supernatural forces were at work. As I said, people are not usually forthcoming with these kind of stories. I hardly ever talk about that episode. However, interaction with the spiritual world is a much more common and widespread phenomenon than is usually acknowledged. If you ask around, I bet you'd be surprised at how many people will have an experience to share. The existence of angels and demons is clearly scriptural and in line with church teaching. We shouldn't be shy about sharing these experiences as evidence just because the materialistic culture scoffs at them. So with that, I want to spend the rest of this video sharing a few of the miracle stories and mystical experiences from interviews I've done over the years. And I hope you'll take them not only as an encouragement about God's goodness, but as encouragement to share your own stories with others. Indeed, Feel free to share some of your stories in the comments. We'll start with what might be considered some smaller miracles, which aren't small to the people who experience them, of course, then move to some bigger ones, and conclude with a couple of mystical experiences. Here's Francis Beckwith.
I began then having doubts about my faith. I became a kind of, I think, emotional agnostic. And it wasn't until my senior year in high school that I really began rethinking what I had given up. And I had one afternoon where I prayed. I asked God to give me a sign. And I had a radio in my room that was on a rock and roll station while I was praying this. And then the radio station changed to the Christian radio station from the rock and roll one. Now, one of my friends said, oh, there's actually a natural explanation for this. And I'm sure there was a natural explanation for it, but it's odd that the natural occurrence would occur roughly around the time in which I'm asking for a sign. So even if you could show that there was some kind of storm that helped my station or my radio to transition to this other station, the fact that it would happen to transition to the Christian station only moments after my making the request shows that it may have not been a miracle that violated the laws of nature, but at least it was a coincidence miracle. So yeah, that was really impactful for me.
You know, I think God does this in the kind of a gratuitous way. He just like shows you incredible graces at the beginning of conversions just to solidify it, kind of because we're so weak in faith at that stage. And so one time I was driving home and I was thinking, God, I really like a jade plant. I love jade plants. And I drove over the corner, and I was in Northern California. So there was a garage sale and it was all jade plants. Like there was nothing in the garage sale that wasn't a jade plant. Like I've never even seen anything like that afterward. But God would just do things like that to kind of strengthen my doubts. Cause I was on some level, I think I thought I was going crazy because I was talking to God. God was communicating back to me, but I felt a little bit crazy. So he would do these kind of really amazing things to show me like I am speaking to you. I do exist. I am with you.
My life started to go like this economically until I found myself living at the Hahn house with no job and no car, and I was in debt, trying to figure out if I was going to become Catholic. So my eternal salvation was at stake, and this was a really difficult time in life. And several weeks were going by, and to exacerbate problems, my mom was at home dying of cancer. And I thought, Lord, is this where you want me to be? And you have got to show me or I am out of here, because I was kind of clinging by my fingernails at this point, walking back and forth in the middle of winter just to attend RCIA and sit in on some of Dr. Hahn's classes. And so, Lord, you got to show me. The next day after I prayed that prayer, Scott comes up to me and said, come with me. I think the school's going to do something for you. We went to the registrar's office. They had no idea who I was. They didn't know, I graduated 7th in my class in my undergraduate. I was a straight A student, but they had nothing on me. They had no idea. But in an hour and a half, I had applied, been accepted, enrolled, and scholarshiped into the Masters of Theology program, and I wasn't even Catholic yet. And so I thought, okay, I guess this is where I'm supposed to be, God. And literally, I'm standing down at the registrar's desk, and I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And I said, God, what good is this scholarship if I can't even go buy the pencils I need to take classes? 2 minutes later, a guy walks around the corner and hands me a $500 voucher and says, go get whatever it is you need from the bookstore. I didn't go to the bookstore. I went to the Adoration Chapel and knelt down and said, okay, I get it. You want me here. Now let's unfold this and see, is this what you want me to do? Am I supposed to become Catholic? And the answer at the end of the day was yes.
The last kind of hurdle for me was Mary in some ways. And I was at the point where I could agree to the intellectual teachings of the church on Mary, but it was like, the journey from here to here is like a long way. And 10 days before we were supposed to enter the church in December of 1987, I get a call from Shea. She's working at Harborview. And brought in a girl. She was 18 months old. She was on the burn ward. She had 3rd-degree burns over 90% of her body. So she calls me and she says, I think that we're supposed to pray for this girl. And look, if we're going to do this Catholic thing, then we need to fish or cut bait. So, the church says that we should ask for the intercession of the saints, including the Blessed Virgin. So are we going to do this or not? I thought, yeah, okay. And I thought, all right, look, God, your church says that it's okay to ask for the intercession of the Blessed Virgin and the saints. I feel really weird doing this, and if I'm doing something wrong, then please tell me and don't strike me dead. Sherry had the same sort of feeling. She went down to the cathedral, she stood in front of the Mary shrine and said a Hail Mary for Sarah, and then she said she ducked out before the lightning bolt struck. So Sherry goes home for the weekend. The doctors are saying it'll be amazing if this girl survives the weekend. She goes back to the room to pray for Sarah, and she walks in there and the bed's empty. So she goes out to the nurse on the floor and says, when did she die? The nurse says, oh, no, she's not dead. She's downstairs. Sherry goes, what, did they transfer to another floor? She says, no. She's down in the playroom. She's playing. Because all of her skin had spontaneously regenerated. And she did not require a single skin graft. So Sherry calls me. Tells me this, right? How do you respond to something like that? We both just sat there. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I thought, okay, well, prayer to the saints. I guess that's okay, And that's, if I've got anything to take away from that experience and to say to anybody, any of you guys, it's that all this is real. The Catholic faith it's tied into reality. That God is alive. That Mary is our mother. That the truths of the faith, the things that the church teaches, are not just theories. They're statements about what the universe is really like.
And I drove myself to Mass, and nobody knew. Nobody knew what I was doing, where I was going. I just kind of sat in the back, and the entire time my head is screaming at me like, you have to go, people know you're a sinner, you need to leave, you don't belong here. And looking back on that, I can say that's Satan, being in my head, because it wasn't just insecurity. These were physical words in my head. And Satan knew he was losing his grip on me. And so to him, this was his worst fear, was I would come back to God. But in my mind, I was like, well, I'm not coming back necessarily. I'm just going to see if this will work. And as I'm being bombarded with all of these thoughts, I'm overwhelmed with anxiety. And it just feels like a weight on me that I've never felt before. And so I'm like, I need to get out. I need to leave. I can't breathe. God had other plans. He instead had two old people on either side of me in the pew come in and sit down, and they're like, oh, hello. And I'm just like, right. I'm like, okay, well, I can't ask them to move. They literally just sat down and they're old. So I was like, okay, well, you know what? During communion, everyone gets up, right? So I'll just sneak out during communion. Nobody will notice. It'll be fine. That was the plan. And then I am anxious the entire time that Mass is going on. And then consecration happens. And I snap out of my anxiety just for a second to hear the bells ring. And I look towards the Eucharist, because the priest is holding it up for transubstantiation. And I look over, and all of a sudden everything freezes. Time completely stops. And at first I thought this was a new low for my mental disorders. I was like, oh, I'm going crazy. This is good. This is great. But then there was a light that emanated from the Eucharist, and I felt a voice speak into my heart. And Jesus said, do you trust me? And I was like, hello? I was like, God? I'm like, this is crazy. And he just kept saying, do you trust me? And I was like, no. I have been through hell the last 8 years. I have been addicted to pornography, masturbation. I have so many mental disorders. You abandoned me. I haven't felt you anywhere in my life for the last 8 years. Where have you been? And he just kept asking. He's like, do you trust me? Do you trust me? And over and over and over again. And the way that I usually like describing it is he took a chisel and a pick and was just, kind of chiseling away the stone cold parts of my heart. because I was so stone cold, like so stone-hearted. And eventually, I did end up having this revelation that I was actually somewhat responsible. At this point, I'm 19. And I'm not responsible for what happened to me, but as an adult now, I am responsible for how I handle it, and why do I continue playing the victim card? Why don't I actually find the healing I not only need, but also deserve as a child of God? God doesn't want me to hurt. He doesn't want those things for me. And then that brought me to the revelation that God never left me. God has always been here. He's always been at every single church. I've had my license for the last 4 years. I could have gone, but I never did. I left him. He never left me, but he always had a hand out calling back to me. And every time I was like, nope, nope. And he actually had to take matters into his own hands and be like, okay, all right, we're just go to church. He's like, I'll do my thing. And over this revelation and time being frozen and everything, and him continuously asking me, do you trust me? Eventually I said, I will try. And after that, that's all he needed, really. I mean, he was just like, okay, great. Good to know. He's just like, and unpause. And then everything went back to normal, but I was changed.
I think many of us perhaps have mystical experiences in our lives. And one thing about them, T.S. Eliot says in his poem, The Hollow Men, between the potency and the existence falls the shadow. So that's true of all sorts of things. But between the potential and the power of an original thing and the existence of the shadow, and certainly mystical experiences, right? The potency of the actual mystical experience and our experience of it, already a shadow's fallen, particularly once time elapses, right? We're thinking about it a day later. Did that really happen the way I remember it? So a shadow falls. But it falls even more when we try to talk about it to others, right? This is really powerful to me. But in the translation to another person, it doesn't seem to work that. But I'll give one. I don't have mystical experiences all the time, and I'm reminded. By the way, I think it was Ronald Knox who said, Ronald Knox says that mysticism begins in mist and ends in schism. Because mysticism has to be anchored in orthodoxy. So even mysticism has to be rooted in reason. If you have a mystical experience, it's irrational. It's not coming from God, because God does not give you anything irrational, right? Because He's the Logos. So anyway, the one that springs to mind. I've had several, but one that springs to mind is I was writing something about the mystical aspect of time. Memory, the future. Does the future exist? Does the present exist? The Chesterton says something about the present is a bit like a point of a needle. That you sit on there is too uncomfortable, isn't it? But also, as a point of a needle, the mathematical point doesn't actually exist, right? So the moment that you are experiencing the present, it's already the immediate past. So none of us are ever living in the present, because by the time we realise that the present is not the present any longer. So we can't live in the present. We can't live in the future, right? So the only place we are living and do live is the past. Now, where we are now is a direct consequence of where we were earlier. Because if we were somewhere else, if I was in Birmingham, Alabama, I wouldn't be here now, right? If I was there an hour ago. So, but the future, of course, does exist, because God is omnipresent. For God, everything is present, right? So I was having this sort of deep sort of writing this treatise, I won't say much about that, on this topic. And I took a break. It was a hot summer's day in England. I was in a graveyard in Norwich. And I thought, I'm going to stop. I'm just going to say the rosary. So I just laid on my back on the grass, amongst the graves, all very evocative, writing it from time. And I said the rosary. And I looked at my watch. Because I was taking a break, and then I said the rosary, and then when I finished the rosary, I looked at the watch, and it was the same time. So the first thing you think of is, well, the watch has stopped, and it hasn't stopped, right? Well, that's just weird. Then you think, well, that's maybe I just misread the watch, but I am capable of telling the time. So the point is, for me, I can rationalize it away. I must have misread the watch, right? You can do that. But for me, to have that experience in unison with the experience I'm having of this mystical engagement with the mystery of time itself, for me, that God, I'm not saying God did suspend time, but I am saying that my experiencing that was a gift of God. Now, whether it's because I misread the thing, then even if I misread the time, it was a gift from God. And so it was a mystical experience. But and I think if we're open to it, most of us have it. It's just a question of listening. If you want God to speak to you, you have to be quiet.